The night was quiet above Dubai's glittering skyline when a scream shattered the calm of the Palm Jumeirah. Security guards stationed along the marina thought they had imagined it, another sound carried off by the wind of the Gulf. But within minutes, police sirens tore across the causeway, piercing the calm that wealthy residents guarded like a prized possession. Inside a penthouse suite lined with marble floors and soft gold lighting, 28-year-old Layla Azam lay bleeding out, her hands still trembling as she tried to shield herself from the final blows. Standing frozen just a few feet away was the man many in the city knew as untouchable, Sheikh Abdullah al-Mansuri. He was not shouting. He was not running. He was perfectly still, staring at the bloody dagger dangling from his hand, a weapon never meant for crime, but for ceremonial display. By the time paramedics rushed in, Layla's heartbeat had already faded to silence. The only sound left in the penthouse was the wail of alarms triggered during the struggle. To the neighbors, it was just noise. To those who witnessed the crime scene, it was a signal that even the world of privilege has cracks that justice can't cover over. This was more than a jealous argument gone wrong. It was a story about betrayal layered under secrecy, a powerful man undone by the one person he trusted most, and a young woman who gambled with deception until she paid the ultimate price. Power in Dubai isn't just measured in money. It's measured in silence, in the ability to keep secrets hidden behind gold-plated gates and glass towers that never reflect the cracks underneath. Sheikh Abdullah was 42 years old, respected, admired, and feared. To the public he was generous, the man who funded charities, supported cultural initiatives, and appeared always in control. But control is fragile when trust is betrayed. For 1 year he kept a secret of his own, an affair with Layla Azam, a woman whose presence could brighten the darkest of rooms, whose beauty and boldness opened doors most people could only dream of entering. To the Sheikh, Layla was more than a passing infatuation. She was the person who made him believe he could live outside the rigid expectations of status, honor, and legacy. He gave her gifts, his time, and most dangerous of all, his trust. But Layla's private life wasn't what it seemed. She had her own version of control, weaving together separate lives with other men who also believed they alone had her affection. It was a dangerous balance, one destined to collapse the moment evidence fell into the wrong hands. This wasn't just another story of desire in the world's playground of wealth. This was about the breaking point when truth refuses to stay buried. When love, lies, and betrayal finally collided on a December night, the outcome wasn't a scandal whispered about at parties. It was the sound of sirens racing toward a penthouse where one life was ending and another was being destroyed by the weight of rage. Ask yourself this: how do you respond when the person you trusted most shatters that trust? Do you walk away? Or does rage consume you until every choice is blurred in red? Sheikh Abdullah al-Mansuri faced that choice the moment a single photograph landed in his hands, showing the woman he believed was his alone locked in another man's embrace. It wasn't just about love. It was about pride, reputation, and the carefully crafted image of control that kept the eyes of an entire city fixed on him. The affair had already been dangerous, conducted in secrecy far above the crowded streets of Dubai. But secrecy has an expiration date. That night in December, it reached its limit. What unfolded wasn't a quiet breakup or the end of an illusion. It was blood on the marble floor of a palace in the sky. And here's where you come in. Stories like these reveal something raw about human nature. Betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it ignites explosions that no amount of money or status can contain. If you believe betrayal leaves scars deeper than any knife, I need you to do one thing now. Support this channel. Smash the like button, subscribe, and keep watching until the end, because this story has lessons people ignore until it's too late. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you discovered a secret like this? Stay with me until the conclusion. You'll see why his decision came at a cost no one could have imagined. Sheikh Abdullah al-Mansuri was not a man who ever expected to face scandal. At 42, he embodied the idea of restraint in a city addicted to excess. To business partners, he was reliable, presenting himself as the calm presence in boardrooms where fortunes were decided. To the public, he appeared polished, generous, a quiet patron of charities who valued culture over spectacle. But in private, Abdullah demanded loyalty with the same intensity that he gave it. Betrayal, whether personal or professional, was a language he never tolerated. Educated in London, he returned home with a taste for art, philanthropy, and the prestige of his family name. Yet beneath the cultivated image, he craved emotional intimacy, someone who could make him feel more than a title, more than a figure others bowed to out of duty. That desire led him to notice Layla Azam at a charity gala, a woman who seemed to shine through the crowd without effort. Layla didn't grow up with wealth. She was born in Ras Al Khaimah, raised in modest circumstances that left her hungry for opportunity. By her late 20s, she had learned how to navigate elite circles with ease, balancing charm, poise, and ambition. Her work in charitable initiatives gave her credibility, while her striking looks drew attention even when she tried to avoid it. For Abdullah, Layla was not just another woman attracted to his status. She represented something rarer, someone unafraid to challenge him, someone who didn't shrink in the shadow of his power. That balance of admiration and defiance kept him invested, setting the stage for a private story that would soon dominate his life. Layla Azam had mastered the art of presence. At 28, she carried herself as if she belonged in rooms built for wealth and influence, though her beginnings offered nothing of the kind. She rose through persistence and charm, first as a model, later as the face of women's empowerment programs that earned her invitations to private fundraisers where she crossed paths with leaders, bankers, and heirs to fortunes. What drew people to her wasn't just beauty, but the confidence with which she addressed them. Sharp in thought, fearless in conversation, unwilling to shrink in front of anyone. Behind that polished exterior, Layla managed multiple lives at once. The world saw her holding microphones at charity events, but privately she divided her time with 4 men besides the Sheikh. Omar Khalif, a broker who promised her stability and a life among Dubai's booming real estate towers. Tariq Bassam, a banker who dazzled her with investments and international trips. Nabil Zaidan, an engineer who offered her earnest devotion, perhaps the most genuine connection of them all. Zaid Hariri, a young media executive eager to climb into the ranks of Dubai's elite. Each man believed in his own exclusivity, blind to the truth that they were part of a carefully constructed web. Every interaction was scheduled, timed so they would never collide. Weekends for Sheikh Abdullah, evenings split between Omar and Tariq, early mornings reserved for Nabil and Zaid. It was a balance sustained through secrecy and precision, but one built on instability. For as flawless as her performance seemed, all it took was a single moment of exposure to send it crashing down. To understand the collision course of this story, you have to see how uneven the scales were between these two lives. Sheikh Abdullah carried the weight of legacy. His last name alone could open vaults and close courtrooms. But that power also chained him, confining him to obligations that demanded respect at every turn. When he sought out companionship, he wasn't just looking for affection. He was searching for someone who could let him forget the crown resting invisibly on his head. In Layla, he found the illusion of freedom. Yet Layla had her own gamble at play. For her, involvement with the Sheikh wasn't simply romantic. It was a step into influence she had never tasted before. Every dinner at his penthouse, every gift slipped discreetly into her hands, every whisper of confidence he shared. All of it fed an ambition that had driven her since her earliest days in Ras Al Khaimah. But ambition has limits, and hers did not stop with one man. While Abdullah believed in exclusivity, she entertained multiple men who each provided something different. Status, protection, financial security, or emotional support. This contrast is what shaped the tragedy that followed. One man convinced his loyalty secured her devotion. One woman believing she could balance more lives than the truth could sustain. To the public, they looked like opposites drawn together by chance. To those who saw the end result, it was clear. Both Abdullah and Layla were carrying more than hearts into their private meetings. They were carrying fragile identities that could not survive once the lies between them surfaced. The first months of Abdullah and Layla's relationship unfolded under layers of secrecy too delicate to disturb. What began with glances across banquet halls quickly became a hidden rhythm in both of their lives. To the outside world, the Sheikh carried on as he always had. Dinners with foreign dignitaries, quiet appearances in philanthropic circles, and measured control that defined his public image. Yet when night fell, another story was written behind doors no outsider could touch. Encrypted messaging apps became their link, conversations crafted in short bursts, guarded against the possibility of interception. For Abdullah, these exchanges were more intoxicating than the events of the day. Layla spoke in a way others dared not, unafraid to tease him, to challenge his decisions, to bring laughter where others only offered silence in deference. He found himself checking his phone between meetings, scanning for her words, reading them twice as if to savor their defiance. Their physical meetings carried the same precision. Chauffeurs swapped shifts to mask timing, routes altered at the last moment, private offices used as waiting rooms before Layla was escorted to the penthouse at Palm Jumeirah. Inside, the world of surveillance cameras and security staff melted away. They dined under soft lighting, voices hushed not out of fear but intimacy. On those nights, Abdullah believed he had carved out a sanctuary where titles and hierarchy carried no weight. But every sanctuary is temporary. For each evening they stole together, layers of risk accumulated. The line between irresistible desire and irreversible consequence grew thinner with every whispered promise in those glittering rooms above the sea. What pulled Abdullah deeper into the affair wasn't only attraction. It was the sense of defiance it stirred in him. He had lived a lifetime within boundaries that demanded composure. Handshakes with leaders, speeches about progress, contracts signed with flawless etiquette. But in Layla's presence, those walls shifted. She interrupted him mid-sentence, laughed when he was meant to be serious, and reminded him he was more than his obligations. Every gesture of hers carried a rawness he had long been denied. For Layla, these nights were a careful calculation. She dressed the role of devoted partner for Abdullah, listening intently as he spoke of business ventures and philanthropic projects, offering ideas that made him feel she saw beyond his wealth. Yet once she left his tower beside the sea, her life fractured into separate lanes. Evenings belonged to Tariq and Omar, who competed unknowingly for her attention. Early mornings were whispered to Nabil and Zaid, who each believed her secrecy was a sign of passion rather than concealment. The demands of this double existence required discipline few could maintain. She scheduled her days with the precision of a CEO, phone always near her palm, alarms set to ensure no crossovers between conversations. She told Abdullah he was the only one who mattered, while at the very same time sending playful notes to others. Each man was convinced he had a unique claim to her heart, and none questioned it until evidence began to surface. This concealed balance held for nearly a year. It was a delicate empire of affection and deception, stable only so long as no one asked the wrong question or saw what was never meant to be seen. As months passed, the secrecy took on its own rhythm. Abdullah showered Layla with luxuries few could imagine. Designer jewelry slipped into silk boxes, unexpected flights on private jets for weekends in Europe, and evenings spent on yachts anchored quietly off the coast. These gestures weren't simply about indulgence. They were his way of reinforcing loyalty, of ensuring she knew the seriousness of his commitment. He had never allowed anyone so close, and each gift carried an unspoken promise. Devotion should flow both ways. Layla played the part convincingly. In his presence, she leaned in with devotion, listening carefully, offering counsel, making him believe she valued him beyond the reach of wealth. To onlookers from his trusted circle, she appeared respectful yet captivating, a partner who provided him with energy often missing from his polished but restrained life. What Abdullah never suspected was that her calendar remained crowded with other men who filled roles he couldn't. A weekend with him might be followed by a dinner with Tariq, whose business trips delivered excitement abroad. Just days after leaving Abdullah's penthouse, she could be seen in the marina with Omar, accepting the promise of investment tips whispered over champagne. Nabil offered her steadiness in quiet hours of the morning, while Zaid thrilled her with ideas about influence in the media industry. Each relationship existed in its own sealed world, carefully insulated from the others. To the Sheikh, these encounters didn't exist. He saw a woman devoting herself fully to him, a partner willing to stand by his side at any cost. The truth, however, crept closer with every passing week, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a single slip to expose everything. By late 2016, the rhythm that once seemed flawless began to strain under its own weight. Abdullah grew more invested in Layla, expecting longer weekends, pressing her to appear at private art gatherings, and speaking of a future that extended beyond hushed meetings. For a man accustomed to absolute loyalty, his growing attachment only deepened the blindness to deception around him. Layla responded with gestures of affection, but the cracks were starting to show. Her carefully balanced schedules collided with unexpected demands. An unplanned dinner request from Abdullah clashed with Tariq's insistence on a late meeting, while Omar's drive for exclusivity cornered her with suspicions. She managed each confrontation with rehearsed charm, slipping from one role to another, never revealing the truth. But beneath that polished mask, the challenge of sustaining 5 separate romances was beginning to take its toll. The Sheikh, proud and guarded, missed the small inconsistencies others might have caught. He only saw a woman who seemed attentive, always near when he called, always ready to reassure him that he had her undivided loyalty. But plans built on deception have a fragile foundation. Every concealed outing, every hidden message, and every promise made to more than one man created a trail she could no longer fully control. It was only a matter of time before proof slipped through her fingers. When it did, the entire world she had balanced with practiced ease would collapse in a single, irreversible moment. For nearly a year, Layla managed to keep her many lives separate, gliding between dinner reservations, charity appearances, and secret encounters. But the walls around her carefully arranged routine began to close in when Tariq Bassam, the investment banker, started doubting her stories. He noticed the sudden cancellations, the delayed replies, the traces of distractions that her charm could no longer disguise. His suspicions were not born out of jealousy alone. They were fueled by a fear that someone else was receiving the same level of devotion he thought was his alone. Tariq made inquiries quietly, pulling strings within his circle until one evening a contact delivered confirmation. A photograph, clear and undeniable, showed Layla on the balcony of a high-rise apartment at Palm Jumeirah. The picture was not of her alone. She stood with Sheikh Abdullah, his arm draped around her shoulder, a possession claimed in plain sight. The revelation struck Tariq harder than he expected, for the image not only confirmed his fears but hinted at the immense power his rival held. Unsure of how to confront her directly, Tariq distributed the photo discreetly. Omar, Nabil, and Zaid each received anonymous copies, slipped into their inboxes and messages without explanation. At first, the men remained silent, unwilling to involve themselves in circumstances that might destroy them socially and professionally. But silence bred resentment, and for the first time, Layla's flawless facade began to fracture. The photograph passed from one man to another like contraband no one wanted to admit holding. Omar studied it in silence, replaying every recent evening he had spent with Layla, searching for clues he had dismissed. Nabil, the engineer, was struck not by rage but by humiliation, realizing that while he thought of her as constant and true, she had stood openly in the arms of another. Zaid, whose ambitions thrived on reputation, felt a surge of panic. His career in media relied on credibility and discretion, both of which could crumble if whispers about involvement with her reached the wrong ears. Their responses varied, but the outcome was the same. Trust was gone, replaced with resentment and fear. None dared confront her directly. Instead, they retreated, waiting, each man weighing how exposure could destroy not only the relationships, but also their standing in Dubai's narrow and watchful social world. In a city where perception shaped opportunity, even the faintest scandal had consequences. Meanwhile, Layla sensed tension without grasping its full source. Small hesitations in their voices, abrupt questions about her whereabouts. These hints unsettled her, but she underestimated how close the walls were closing around her. For the first time, the safety net she had woven from charm and secrecy began to slip, and cracks in her structure became visible. Beyond the circle of men now aware of one another's existence, the photograph was heading toward the one person least prepared to see it, Sheikh Abdullah al-Mansuri himself. On the afternoon of December 17, 2016, a plain envelope arrived at Sheikh Abdullah's residence. It carried no seal, no return address, nothing to reveal its sender. Laid against his desk, the paper inside carried a single image. Layla standing close to Omar Khalif, both framed on the balcony of a Dubai Marina apartment. Those who knew Abdullah described a man rarely shaken. In meetings, his voice held steadiness, His posture never revealed unease. But that evening the aide standing nearby witnessed something different. The Sheikh stared at the image for several moments, his hand gripping the corner so tightly it crumpled beneath his fingers. His silence, more than any outburst, gave away the storm gathering inside. He dismissed the aide and requested a private dinner for two the following night. No words of anger, no accusations allowed, just a calm instruction. Yet the tone was different, edged with something colder than those closest to him had ever heard. Layla received his invitation without hesitation, unsuspecting of what awaited her. She believed it would be another celebration of his birthday week, another evening wrapped in luxury and closeness. To her, the dangers lurking around her fragile balancing act had not yet materialized into true threat. But for Abdullah, the photograph was no longer just a picture. It was an open wound that stripped away illusion. By the time night fell on December 18th, he was no longer preparing for a dinner in silence. He was preparing for confrontation. December 18th, 2016. The penthouse at Palm Jumeirah was quiet, prepared for an evening that only two people were meant to share. Staff had placed fine dishes across the dining table, but the atmosphere that usually carried warmth seemed strangely restrained. Candles flickered, but the mood was cold, charged with an edge that Layla would not notice until it was too late. She arrived dressed elegantly, carrying the confidence that had always disarmed him. For her, the dinner was routine, part of the rhythm of their affair. To Abdullah, it was nothing of the sort. He greeted her with the softness she expected, guiding her inside, pouring the wine, offering small talk that almost concealed the weight of what was to come. Almost. For over an hour, he maintained the silence of a practiced performer. Layla spoke of her day, of an upcoming charity event, of trivial exchanges with friends. His smile remained, but his eyes never softened. Every word she uttered was interrupted in his mind by the image delivered in that envelope. He had replayed it all night, and now as she moved across the room, it burned beneath his surface like a scar pressed raw. When the moment came, he reached into his jacket and placed the folded photograph between them on the table. No speech, no accusation, just a simple gesture. The paper lay there like a verdict waiting to be read. Layla's laughter faltered, her expression shifting in an instant. The performance that had fooled many no longer seemed enough. Layla stared at the photograph as if it had the power to undo her. For a moment, silence pressed down heavier than any accusation. She reached for words, steady at first, then cracking as she searched his expression. "It was marketing," she insisted, her voice tightening. "A staged image for the gala, taken without context." She pushed the paper back toward him, forcing a smile, but her eyes betrayed the tremor beneath. Abdullah did not move. His stare pinned her more sharply than any raised voice could. To servants and associates, he was known for composure. In that room, his control was unraveling thread by thread. "You think my name is a stage for your illusion?" His tone was quiet, each syllable clipped, carrying more menace than a yell ever could. She reached across the table, trying to hold his hand, but he pulled back, his jaw tightening. Her attempts at explanation grew frantic, half-truths tangled with appeals for trust. She leaned forward, reminding him of their late-night laughter, the secrets shared in whispered messages. Yet he heard none of it. Every sentence fell flat, drowned by the single image drilled into his mind. Behind his silence was more than jealousy. It was humiliation, the realization that he had paraded her through his guarded world, believing her loyalty was his alone. In a city where pride defined power, that realization was a wound far deeper than betrayal itself. Layla's words faltered. The tension between them shifted from strained conversation to something raw, volatile, and dangerously close to breaking. The air in the penthouse grew heavier with every second she failed to convince him. Layla's voice shifted from composure to desperation. Hands clasped, she tried to present devotion, to weave explanations that might soften the blow. Abdullah remained still, his posture unervingly calm, his stare fixed on her as though she was already a stranger. "Tell me the truth," he said finally, his voice low but shaking at the edges. It was not a plea. It was a demand born from pride wounded beyond repair. She swallowed hard and repeated her claim. "There's nothing beyond us." But even as she said it, her eyes betrayed doubt. He saw hesitation, and in it, proof that the photograph was not a fabrication. He rose slowly from his chair, the scrape of wood against marble echoing louder than her words. Crossing to the cabinet, he opened a lacquered chest that held prized relics, a collection he guarded as much as his reputation. From it he drew a Khanjar dagger. Its polished blade caught the light, gleaming against the shadows dancing through the room. Layla gasped, rising to her feet. "Please, this is madness," she said, stepping back, her tone suddenly stripped of confidence. She reached out as if her hands alone could contain the storm unraveling before her. The Sheikh's breaths came harsh now, composure collapsing into fury. The sound of glass shattered as the table between them tipped, plates crashing to the ground. Her retreat faltered as he advanced, dagger in hand, eyes no longer cold but blazing with a rage his voice could not suppress. In that moment, denial gave way to terror. The confrontation had reached the edge of no return. The room that had once been their sanctuary now felt like a trap closing in. Layla pressed herself against the edge of the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes locked on the blade in Abdullah's hand. She raised her palms defensively, pleading through trembling words, but her voice broke under the rising wave of his fury. "After everything I gave you," he growled, his grip tightening around the handle. "You gave yourself to others." His words carried years of entitlement, pride, and now betrayal sharpened into rage. The penthouse alarms triggered as glass from an overturned vase shattered across the floor, a sensor jolted by the sudden chaos. Outside, the lights of Dubai glittered indifferently, blind to the violence building within. Inside, the clash of restraint and fury reached its breaking point. He lunged. She stumbled backward, hands striking against the table for balance, sending silverware clattering across marble. The first strike cut into her arm as she raised it to shield her chest. She screamed, the sound muffled by the walls towering around them. His second thrust forced her further toward the ground, her voice failing as blood stained the fabric of her dress. Struggles echoed through the grand suite, footsteps colliding with furniture, glass splintering beneath their movements. For neighbors, it was a faint disturbance. For Layla, it was the unraveling of her final moments. By the time her legs gave way and she collapsed onto the floor, the confrontation had transformed into something irreversible. This was no longer an argument. It was the prelude to murder. The guard stationed outside the Palm Jumeirah complex later recalled hearing unusual noises. Thuds, a woman's cry, the crash of breaking glass. Inside the penthouse, the violence had escalated past the point of hesitation. Abdullah's dagger struck again, slicing through Layla's desperate defenses as she staggered across the polished floor. She raised her arms to shield her chest, but every movement was answered with another violent thrust. Cuts tore into her forearms, crimson streaking across the marble as she tried to push him away. Her strength faltered, slipping under the weight of his fury. Neighbors in adjacent suites phoned security when alarms began to wail, but the minutes between Layla's first scream and the arrival of help seemed endless. Inside, nothing slowed the Sheikh's attack. 12 plunges of steel drove into her body, relentless, each leaving deeper wounds than the last. The final strikes pierced her left lung, then her heart, leaving her gasping for air she could no longer take in. The dagger he used was not random. It came from his private collection, a ceremonial weapon once displayed in a carved case. Its hilt bore the crest of his family, an emblem that, until that night, had symbolized heritage and prestige. Now it carried only blood, a mark of violence impossible to erase. As Layla collapsed, she clawed at the ground in fading resistance. Her eyes searched his face, lips forming words too broken by pain to be understood. By the time she pressed her final breath into the cold silence, he stood motionless, the weapon still gripped in his hand, his rage exhausted, replaced by a hollow stare. The alarms continued to blare as footsteps thundered in the hallway outside the penthouse. A chauffeur stationed in the garage later testified that he heard muffled sounds above, shouts, the crash of furniture, and finally silence. By the time building security managed to override the suite's locks, What they entered was less a home and more a crime scene. Layla lay sprawled across the marble, her dress soaked through, the once vivid fabric torn and darkened by blood. Shards of glass reflected the flashing red lights from the alarm panels, scattering distorted stains across the floor. The trail of her final struggle was plain to see. Overturned chairs, streaks where she had dragged herself inches from the lounge toward the door, hands bloodied from attempts to crawl away. Abdullah stood only a few feet from her body. Reports later described his demeanor as eerily calm. His breathing steady, the weapon still clutched loosely in his hand. When guards entered, there was no attempt to flee, no effort to conceal the act. He extended the dagger toward one officer, surrendering it with a grim expression etched across his face. His only words in that moment were quiet, "It's done." Within minutes, paramedics arrived, sliding to the ground beside Layla. They checked for signs of life, but the result was unmistakable. At 11:47 p.m., she was pronounced dead in the very room where only hours earlier a dinner table had been set for celebration. The difference between intimacy and tragedy had been written in seconds, and all that remained was silence, interrupted only by the frantic radio calls of responding officers. In the days that followed, forensic specialists dissected every detail of what had taken place inside the penthouse. The autopsy confirmed 12 stab wounds, each delivered with force. Several cuts lined her forearms, evidence of defensive attempts to block the blade. The most severe wounds struck her chest, 2 puncturing the left lung, 1 piercing directly through the heart. The medical examiner concluded that the chest trauma caused rapid internal bleeding, overwhelming her body within minutes. The weapon told its own story. The dagger, a ceremonial khanjar from Abdullah's private collection, carried his family crest etched into the hilt. Forensic technicians matched blood residue and patterns on the blade to the sequence of wounds, establishing that the weapon had been used repeatedly, not in hesitation but in a sustained assault. Spatter across the marble floor mapped Layla's movements as she retreated, arms raised, staggered backward, collapsed, and struggled for seconds before her final collapse near the suite's entrance. Investigators documented the scene with precision. The shattered glass indicated at least one violent collision with the dining table, likely during the first wave of blows. Bloodstains marked the corners where she tried to resist, dragging herself across the polished stone. Analysts drew a timeline of fewer than 20 minutes from the confrontation's eruption to her final breath. Despite the brutality, the scene revealed no attempt to cover tracks. The Sheikh had not fled, washed, or hidden evidence. He had remained standing, weapon in hand, until officers took him into custody. His crime was laid bare in the open, the result of rage too consuming to disguise. The Dubai Police Criminal Investigation Department treated the killing as a high-priority case from the moment officers radioed it in. Uniformed police sealed off the Palm Jumeirah Tower, escorting onlookers away as forensic units arrived with cameras, kits, and evidence bags. The presence of royalty complicated matters, but the blood on the floor spoke louder than titles. Investigators collected Layla's phone, which was still buzzing with unanswered messages on the nightstand. Within hours, they cataloged conversations revealing her web of relationships. The digital logs were overwhelming. Affectionate texts to Omar, business arrangements with Tariq, playful exchanges with Zaid, and tender reassurances to Nabil, all overlapping with her declarations of devotion to Abdullah. The evidence transformed suspicion into a clear narrative. The photograph had merely confirmed what was already true. Witness testimony also played its part. The chauffeur who had been stationed below recounted how muffled shouts and the sound of breaking glass echoed from above. Security officers testified that when they entered the penthouse, Abdullah surrendered the dagger immediately, standing over her body without resistance. Yet the case was far from straightforward. Legal protocols demanded equal treatment under homicide charges, but Abdullah's last name complicated every step. Closed-door meetings between prosecutors and royal legal advisors began almost instantly. The city whispered of justice and privilege colliding, though no one dared speak openly in public. Behind the sealed doors of the station, evidence piled higher by the hour, but the ultimate question was not whether Abdullah had killed Layla. It was how the system would decide to punish him, or whether it would punish him at all. Forensic evidence left no room for doubt. Blood patterns matched the sequence of Abdullah's attack, and the ceremonial dagger held not only her DNA but also residue confirming repeated use. Eyewitnesses placed him at the scene, immobile, weapon in hand. In most cases, such evidence would lead directly to charges of premeditated murder. But this was no ordinary defendant. Behind closed walls, legal teams began reframing the crime. Royal advisors argued that Abdullah had acted in a temporary state of emotional collapse after discovering betrayal. The phrase "loss of self-control" appeared in early drafts of the prosecutor's notes, hinting at the path they would pursue. What would have been treated as intent in another man was reshaped into sudden impulse for him. 2 months of investigation produced a thick case file, yet whispers among court clerks revealed pressure from above. Prosecutors eventually filed charges of involuntary manslaughter, reasoning that although the attack was violent, it lacked calculation. The difference was not trivial. What could have been decades behind bars was reduced to a maximum of 3 years. The trial itself unfolded quietly. Proceedings were closed to the public, documented only through brief official statements released afterward. Media outlets in Dubai, constrained by strict oversight, reported cautiously, publishing only sanitized headlines. Behind those clipped updates, however, the reality was stark. The courtroom heard how Layla lived 2 lives, how her secrets had provoked the crime, and how the Sheikh's reputation left the judiciary balancing justice with caution. By March 2017, the outcome was sealed, not as murder, but as manslaughter, setting the stage for a sentence that shocked those who followed the case from the shadows. March 2017 arrived with a verdict that few could have predicted from the crime scene alone. The court sentenced Sheikh Abdullah al-Mansouri to 18 months in confinement, reduced further by allowances for his contributions to society. The word murder never appeared in official verdict summaries. Instead, the ruling emphasized a temporary collapse in judgment, a moment of passion transformed into tragedy. Abdullah was transferred not to the central prison but to a discreet detention facility reserved for high-profile inmates. Reports from insiders described private quarters, catered meals, and visits from select family members. His time there bore little resemblance to the experience faced by ordinary men convicted of far lesser crimes. By December of that same year, good behavior credits secured his early release, 9 months after Layla's final breath. The 4 men connected to Layla faced no legal charges. However, each endured personal humiliation, pressured into issuing statements of regret for their roles in her double life. Families leaned heavily on them to retreat from public visibility. Careers stalled. Reputations, once their strongest currency, dissolved quietly in professional circles. The public reaction was divided. Whispers spread across coffee shops, private gatherings, and online platforms. Many viewed the case as proof that status insulated him from real consequences. At the same time, women's groups in the region highlighted Layla's death in vigils, holding candles beneath banners marked "Justice for Layla." Their protests broke traditional silence, pushing for changes in how such cases would be tried. Though the trial had officially ended, the debates it sparked continued long afterward, raising an uncomfortable question. In matters of blood and betrayal, was justice in Dubai truly blind, or did it bow when confronted with power? Layla's death sent a quiet shockwave across Dubai. Official news outlets reported it in restrained terms, avoiding the full scandal, but within private circles the story circulated with relentless energy. Every detail whispered behind closed doors, her secret relationships, his violent outburst, spread faster than the controlled headlines ever could. High society dinners became arenas of speculation, each retelling shaping the narrative to suit the speaker's bias. Women's advocacy groups, long reluctant to challenge authority directly, found in Layla's case a rallying point. Small vigils grew into organized gatherings, candles burning against the night sky as mourners invoked her name with calls for reform. The phrase "Justice for Layla" appeared across placards, echoed in online discussions, and forced public officials to confront questions they often avoided. Were the laws equal for all? Could influence soften punishment where blood had been spilled? The Ministry of Interior soon announced a review of sentencing guidelines for violent crimes, promising greater transparency in trials involving figures of privilege. While the gesture placated some, Many saw it as symbolic, a cosmetic measure against entrenched inequality. Still, the conversation it sparked marked a shift. For the first time in years, the loss of one young woman had pierced the silence that usually cloaked the city's elite. Outside the UAE, Layla's death appeared in fragmented reports, each filtered through cautious language. Still, the international business community took notice. Foreign investors, already wary of opaque legal systems, questioned how justice could shift so drastically when a royal was involved. Behind boardroom doors in London, Frankfurt, and New York, concerns over accountability in Dubai became part of private conversations. Some deals stalled, others slowed, all shadowed by the lingering perception that influence outweighed law. For Abdullah, release from detention marked a hollow freedom. Though officially welcomed back into his family's fold, his public profile never recovered entirely. Cultural foundations he once funded distanced themselves, suspending activities until audits cleared them of impropriety. Invitations to high-level events dwindled. While his wealth ensured comfort, the aura of untouchable respect surrounding him had fractured. In elite gatherings, whispers trailed every appearance, and many who once sought his attention now kept their distance. The four men tied to Layla's concealed relationships each took divergent paths, but none emerged unscathed. Omar relocated to Abu Dhabi, retreating into property ventures with little visibility. Tariq abandoned the region altogether, moving to London in search of anonymity. Nabil accepted a transfer to Kuala Lumpur, building an isolated life far from scandal. Zaid, the youngest and most ambitious, withdrew entirely from the charity world, abandoning a career he once prized. None faced courts, but their reputations, once valuable currency in Dubai's competitive social ladders, dissolved almost overnight. Years after the night of Layla's death, her story remained a point of reference whenever questions of power and justice arose in the region. Official statements tried to bury the case under layers of controlled memory, yet it refused to fade. University debates, online forums, and whispered conversations in cafes kept bringing it back, each retelling reinforcing the divide between privilege and accountability. Women's rights advocates marked anniversaries of her death with renewed calls for reform. Some of these efforts succeeded in reshaping policy, at least on paper. New directives required courts to provide public summaries even in sensitive cases, a small but symbolic gesture toward transparency. Though far from revolutionary, it carried Layla's name indirectly into the language of reform. For average citizens, the case carried a simple, haunting lesson. Even in a city built on precision and order, hidden choices could spiral out of control, shattering both the mighty and the powerless. Parents told daughters her story as a warning, while young men repeated it as a grim reminder of how pride and desire can end in ruin. Layla was no longer alive to defend herself, but her legacy forced others to ask questions they had once been too cautious to voice. The silence that had protected elites for so long cracked just enough to reveal its weakness, and her fate became the echo that refused to die. The story of Sheikh Abdullah and Layla Azam is not simply about one violent night. It is about the hidden dangers that lurk when pride, power, and secrecy collide. He craved devotion without questioning the cost. She chased independence and influence without recognizing how fragile her balancing act had become. Their choices intersected in a way that left neither victorious. One man dismantled by rage, one woman silenced forever. The lesson stretches beyond Dubai's towers. It touches anyone who has ever placed blind faith in another, anyone who has believed that loyalty could be demanded or purchased rather than earned. Betrayal cuts deeper than we admit because it doesn't just wound the heart. It destroys the identity we build around trust. That destruction can provoke outcomes no amount of wealth or charm can undo. Layla's story reminds us that chasing power through deceit brings consequences. Abdullah's downfall tells us that pride and unchecked anger can ruin even those who stand at the highest levels of privilege. Together, their tragedy reveals that the line between control and collapse is often thinner than we dare to believe. Ask yourself, what do you take from this story? Betrayal is more than lies whispered in the dark. It creates a chain reaction that can destroy reputations, lives, and futures in an instant. Pride left unchecked can turn heartbreak into violence. And silence, when wrapped around the powerful, allows injustice to breathe unchecked. For some, Layla is a cautionary tale about ambition tied to deception. For others, Abdullah embodies how rage and entitlement can transform loyalty into cruelty. Together, they expose the reality that choices driven by ego and desire rarely end in control. They end in chaos and consequence. This is why stories like this must be told. Because if they are forgotten, so are the lessons they carry. And here's where I turn to you directly. Don't just watch and walk away. If you believe loyalty should matter, if you believe stories like Layla's should not fade into silence, then you have a responsibility. Support this channel. Subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video so these lessons reach further than the walls of a single city. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you have stayed until this point, type it out. I want to know who values these truths enough to hear them to the end. Layla's death and Abdullah's downfall might feel distant, events tucked away in the luxury of Dubai's towers, but the truth behind them is universal. Trust, once broken, can drive people to extremes. Ambition, when built on deception, may offer brief rewards, but it always leaves scars. And pride, when allowed to dictate the heart, can turn even the most powerful into prisoners of their own rage. These stories matter because they show us how fragile life becomes when we believe secrecy will protect us. They remind us that justice should not depend on last names, wealth, or influence, but on honesty, fairness, and accountability, values that keep societies from collapsing under the weight of corruption. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you. It means you recognize that stories like this are more than entertainment. They are warnings, lessons carried in blood and silence. I need you to act now. Subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this story so others can learn from it. Drop a comment telling me why you're still watching at this point. It proves you're one of the few who sees value in knowing the cost of betrayal and unchecked pride. Don't let this story vanish into the noise. Keep it alive, keep the lessons alive.